while the temperatures are slightly lower this week, it's still hot out there, and the heat will still be a big concern for parents, coaches too, of high school athletes and younger hitting the fields for their first football practices this week. A group of researchers from the Heat Policy Innovation Hub at Duke's Nicholas Institute have come up with some very specific recommendations meant to keep student athletes safe as they train and compete in these really hot temperatures. Those include targeting improvements in measuring heat stress, activity modification guidelines, so what to do out there in the heat, and emergency action plans that can be implemented across sports and various venues. Joining us tonight is Jordan Clark, a postdoctoral associate at the Nicholas Institute, who wrote this brief. Jordan, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, how do you and your colleagues hope these recommendations will be utilized by parents and coaches as things get started here?
Well, so overall, just really wanting to further raise awareness was certainly a motivating factor, but the critical need is for requiring really precise measurements of heat and other things such as wind with handheld devices at a given location. How hot it is at one place on a high school campus can be quite different from another, and certainly a lot different from whatever the closest weather station is, which can be tens of miles away. Now, there should be strict rules for changing activity based on these measurements, as you mentioned, and that includes things like changing how often water breaks occur and what kind of equipment can be safely worn. But the critical piece there ultimately is using something called wet bulb globe temperature. While most are familiar with the heat index or the feels like temperature, which indicates how hot it feels based on air temperature and humidity, WBGT goes a step further by also accounting for how the wind and the sunlight affect our body temperature. So it's really telling us how hot it feels when you factor in things like sweat and whatever surface you're on, whether it be a tennis court or a grass surface. And the North Carolina High School Athletic Association is actually a great example of one state association implementing these requirements.
When we think of the different age groups, my twin 6-year-olds, they're a little younger. I think of them as being more vulnerable because they're younger. But then again, we have the older kids who are definitely exerting themselves a lot more. Football, they're wearing pads and helmets out there in this heat. So who is the most vulnerable, age group to pay attention to here?
So a lot of factors make one person more vulnerable to heat than others, and age is certainly an important part of that, with infants and toddlers, along with those over the age of 65, as you mentioned, being more vulnerable. And youth overall, even up to age 18, are somewhat more vulnerable than adults. But in reality, and especially here, and certainly when it comes to talking about intense physical activity outdoors, like in sports, everyone could be vulnerable, and that vulnerability changes over time based on things like how hydrated you are leading up to an outdoor activity, if you have chronic conditions or certain medications that you take that may increase your risk, and overall just how exposed you have been over the past several weeks to heat, because that exposure over the past several weeks is ultimately going to determine how well you are going to be able to handle a sudden change or a sudden practice in extreme heat.
Okay, that's interesting. So as a parent, make sure that your kid is getting a lot of time indoors in the air conditioning, that sort of thing. But how else can we empower parents? What should they look for when their kids take the practice field in a week or so?
Well, so first, I quickly want to emphasize that these recommendations don't even have to be geared towards a specific sport. They can be used to protect a variety of youth outdoor activities, including things like summer camps and even marching band. But an important consideration and something that parents, I think, really should be aware of and help communicate and understand in conversation with coaches or et cetera, is making sure that weather measurements are being taken and what specifically is being measured, with wet bulb globe temperature being the best. And it would also be important to make sure that it's being measured specifically where it is, whether it be a football field or a tennis court. And some additional things to kind of get this conversation going and make it robust is trying to understand if there are cooling options such as ice immersion tubs that can be on site for very hot days. Is there unlimited access to water? And asking these questions and this dialogue is
Right.
key here. Because the communication between parents, coaches, and athletic trainers and associations and the players themselves is ultimately the best way of getting all of this information together and mitigating the impact of heat on the student athletes.
Certainly. Thank you, Jordan Clark with Duke's Nicholas Institute. Great information. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.